Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Human Element. Today I'm speaking with Jameson Ritter, Director of Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management at CPPS. Jameson, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Would you start off by sharing a bit about your background and how you got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my background is, I joke, it's kind of a Forrest Gump-like journey through life and work. But as far as work goes, military and law enforcement background. Spent a handful of years in the Air Force and then jumped into local law enforcement, where I spent the last 2 or 3 years at the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Minneapolis. So looking really heavily into, targeted violence, radicalization, pathway to radicalization, things like that in the terrorism world. And then from there, jumped into the private sector on the corporate security side. And in that process, got heavily involved in behavioral threat assessment and management, the violence prevention, kind of the human element, no pun intended, on how do we prevent violence, what kind of programs, what kind of policies, and more importantly, what can we do with our people to get to kind of understand what violence prevention is. And so that's where basically most of the hats I wear right now are in helping organizations do a better job at violence prevention, making sure the right things are in place, and ultimately getting our people ready to help us do that. So that is where I spend most of my time now. Large companies, small companies, wherever they need the help is where I go.
Sounds interesting. I suspect you're pretty busy.
Yeah, especially these days. I mean, it's like anything else in the security world. The more high profile things happen, more incidents, more news, the more the phone rings. My job is obviously to answer the questions when they come, but also try to get ahead of some of those trends and help folks get to the point where they don't have to deal with the news and the aftermath of things. Really heavy on the left of bang stuff, if you will, for lack of a better term.
Would you tell us about a couple major life events that have shaped your leadership style?
Part of it for me was the transition from the public sector, from a heavy law enforcement background, is very, very focused on response and what do we do if something has already happened. So whether that's a call for service, if you're a patrol officer, whether that's a SWAT response, if there's a crisis or emergency, active assailant, things like that. And I'd say for me, the big switch that happened when I made the jump into terrorism and then ultimately the jump into the kind of the protective side of corporate security and prevention is that mindset change. So seeing from the law enforcement perspective the true tragedy of what happens when we don't prevent things, either direct experience with me or responding to terrorism events, things like that, and how the aftermath of something that happens. For me, it was, instead of an inflection point, more of a journey where the further I became a student of violence, the deeper I became a student of violence, the more I recognized what we were missing, where the gaps are. And that's on the prevention side. That's on the, how do we really focus on that left of bank stuff? And for me, I've had a couple incidents as an officer, responded to a handful of terrorism events right here in Minnesota, where I'm based, to see the true aftermath, and then hear the questions that come, even the ones we hear on the news now. The what can we do better, or why does this keep happening? Just all of the normal, and hearing the constant recycling of those same refrains sort of spurred me towards this field of behavioral threat assessment and management. The dealing with the human element piece is the answer, and I feel like I learned, it took me many, many years to get there. Again, as a student of violence on the other end, that was a transition, and that was a difficult one, I think, and that is for a lot of people that have made that transition from, say, the public sector, law enforcement, federal, state, and local, all the way over to a consulting role like mine, or corporate security, or wherever you find yourself. Is that, you come from a directive, proactive, "This is the way we do things. This is how it's done," this very tactical mindset, to something completely different. And I think it took some near misses, both in the public and then ultimately the private sector, to really reinforce that for me, and to really kind of shift my mindset to go out and look for those solutions and learn them. And one of my many stories is I'm an eternal student. So I never stop. It's always trying to learn more about the subject and get better at it so I can help other people figure things out.
I imagine the transition from the public sector to the private sector hits you with some interesting components, like, the tools you have available as a law enforcement agent in the field when those vaporize, and now you have the ability to kind of look more towards the future as opposed to being purely reactive, but you don't have the same capabilities to react. How does that land?
It's a great question. I mean, I went from a task force officer with the FBI with essentially with the huge team that is federal law enforcement and intelligence community to back all of the work that you do. And then you go to, say, even a large corporation with a corporate security infrastructure where budget and time and technology and just the size of your team and your access to data and information is so limited in comparison to where you came from. You all of a sudden you end up in this kind of little box where you're only looking at internal issues or things that, essentially anybody in the world, news and just generally available social media stuff and internal reporting. That's a big jarring change to not have that. You're basically going from this huge team with all of essentially the world's resources available at your fingertip to a small, handful of people working around a table trying to figure out how to solve at least your world's problems. Yeah, jarring. But in a good, looking at it in the positive sense, this is where you got to get creative, where you have to learn to leverage people, leverage the talents of your team, work without technology where maybe you were heavily reliant on it before, or find smarter ways to use technology. So a lot of different opportunities to learn and grow through that process for sure.
Nice. Is there a non-technical skill that has had considerable impact on your leadership style?
For me, I think part of that soft skills piece, the ability to persuade and influence others, I think is a talent that I'm still learning, but I think has become as more and more important in what I do because even if you sit in my chair and I think we have the right answers for some of these questions society is asking right now or individual organizations and groups, but unless I can convince other people that that's true, that this is the way, and please let me help you with this, it's all for naught. I mean, I can write a million posts online, I can do podcasts, I can try and exert influence in other ways, but if I can't get in front of a client or an organization and say, "Let me tell you about this thing called threat management, threat assessment and management, and how it can actually help you avoid things like active assailant, active shooter, or some of these other security concerns. Let me help you with the human elements so that we can spend less time on response and more time on prevention." It's work, it's hard work. But to answer your question more directly, it's a talent and a skill to be able to tell people things, even non-technical things in a way that brings them along the journey with you. And so for me, it's telling of stories, telling of in my corporate security and consulting experience, get them emotionally involved in things like near misses where we've had incidents happen that could have resulted in significant injury or death, for example, in the worst case scenario, and how what we did worked or didn't work, and use that to leverage kind of the emotional connection. I think that's one of the strengths that I had to learn leaving the law enforcement world and coming into this, where a softer approach is not only necessary, it's kind of expected. You can't come in and say, "This is the way, follow the way, do this." It's not like that. I have to convince a bunch of people who make all these critical decisions that this guy named Jameson Ritter might have a answer that might work for this organization, and let me take you along the journey with me, I guess.
Ah, that's interesting. So, kind of continuing along that theme, are there any mistakes you can share that led to significant personal growth?
Mistakes, some big, some little. I'd say, talking on in terms of violence, and I'm gonna say that this is nothing specific to me, particularly as somebody who worked in law enforcement, but many of us, a lot of us have had near misses or things that we've walked away from and said, "God, that could have ended in a terrible way," or really did end terribly, and we learn lessons, and that's how we grow. I've had several since leaving that and going into the private sector where we've had, I work in workplace violence, and we'd have, for example, an incident where somebody was killed by a spouse, an employee was killed by a spouse. only come to learn later through some internal investigation and law enforcement involvement that the plot by this particular person actually involved several team members within the organization. And it wasn't for any lack of capability. We had a perfectly functioning threat assessment team. If somebody had reported these issues early, we might have been able to intervene and potentially save at least one life. But as it turns out, there's no reason that if this wasn't a larger tragedy. We weren't involved, which means we couldn't exert any influence or try to change the trajectory of this tragedy. We didn't do anything wrong per se, but it drove home the point that if we're not doing a better job of connecting all of our people together and getting them comfortable, it's that old Homeland Security post 9/11. We say, that often used phrase, see something, say something. Well, we've embodied that in corporate security and a lot of these organizations, but see what? Tell who? How comfortable are you? And when you're talking about a domestic violence situation, which is super high risk for us as an organization, people are generally uncomfortable having those conversations. So how do you convince them that not only it's good for them to talk about, but for peers who see something and say, this person's going through some tough times? For me, those kind of near misses, and I've got a handful of those through my time in threat assessment and management, where I said, the tragedy occurred not necessarily because we didn't do anything, but because we didn't even know about it. We couldn't have influenced it for the better. And that sticks with you. So everything I do from then on is I remember this feeling of what it was like to be blindsided by tragedy and not having a good answer for why we weren't able to influence other than we didn't know about it. So how does that drive? And that drives a lot of the things I do. And that's one of the stories when you asked me earlier about that transition and those moments of connection and soft skills. When I tell stories like that in a training session, for example, or building a program, it emotionally hits home because they can see it. They can see something like that in their own organization, and they can also see that they're vulnerable. So those type of things are formative for me as a professional. Also very emotional for me because this is the world I've claimed to be part of now, and I'm trying to help. But you have to take those lessons. And unfortunately, in the violence world in which I live, and many of us live, we get our greatest traction and our greatest opening for change during tragedy. So it's both a personal motivator and an opportunity to connect in a way that I think we need to leverage. Unfortunately, these things happen, and we need to do a good job of connecting people to what can be done and how can you help those things.
So that actually kind of brings up another interesting topic. Something we talk about cybersecurity all the time, which is kind of mental health around the team members. This is we deal with a lot, and you very clearly have had some pretty intense situations. How do you map that into management? How do you take care of your team in those kind of environments?
Again, another great question, and one that is still new for us. And so the organization that I belong to, a professional organization called ATAP, Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and this type of conversation, we got really good at talking about trauma and trauma informed and stuff when dealing with other people. This is the trend. We're all heading in this right direction, I think, where we're having these conversations now. Where before, somebody in law enforcement, you might not talk about things like this for yourself. You might talk about it for other people or for victims that you deal with and things. In threat management, we're only just starting down the road of understanding how to keep our teams healthy because you're right. We're talking about some very, very tough subjects and unfortunately some terrible tragedies on occasion. And our very reason for being is to prevent those things. And so when things happen, it's easy to turn inward and say, what did I do wrong? Or what did the team do wrong? What I'm proud of is as ATAP as an organization is really putting focus on those at conferences and speaking events to really talk about how you, as they say, a threat assessment team leader, can keep an eye on your team and really check in with them. So things like temperature checks. How are you doing? That was a really tough case. We did the best we could. We've got your back. Just small touch points, I think, make a big difference. And in tragedy, for example, one of my former teams at United Healthcare, United Health Group here in Minnesota, recently dealt with a terrible tragedy as a senior leader was a victim of targeted violence. and just checking in with them, even as I'm not even part of the organization anymore, but I understand how impactful it is, and checking in and saying, "Hey, is there anything I can do? I know there's not much you can tell me." And I'm not asking. I'm just saying, "Hey, do you need to get together? Do you need to talk about anything?" Things like that. That stuff, those soft skills, I think, make a huge difference, especially when we're trying to navigate some of those maybe less talked about subjects like mental health and other things. But I'm glad to be part of that conversation. I'm glad the organization I spend so much time involved with has taken that seriously. As a profession, we're starting to have these conversations better, for sure.
Good to hear. Is there any one individual who really changed your trajectory?
Several. I mean, I'm very, very lucky to have a lot of, in my case, a lot of really strong role models and mentors throughout my early adulthood and beyond. Obviously, I'd say my father was a big one. Now, of course, a lot of the wisdom of your parents don't come through to translate well until you're older and you become a parent and start seeing some of these things and go, "Oh, I remember when he
You
said."
start sounding like them and go, "Oh, I get it now."
Right. He wasn't that far off. My dad had some great wisdom, and I didn't listen to him at the time, but I think a lot of things that I learned the hard way through life, he had sort of prepped the understanding. He tried to tell you, the understanding that you're gonna have to learn anyway, and I think that's a normal parenting. I had another very, very good mentor of mine named Randy, who was a retired Vietnam era veteran, somebody I just befriended along the way and started spending a lot of time with, especially early college years. He talked a lot about his service in the military, and it wasn't always great. He didn't give you the glossy version of rah-rah service, uniform, all the other stuff. In fact, when I had initially started talking to him about, potentially joining the military myself and becoming part of that community, he gave me some very unfiltered advice at the time, which I can't translate in a public venue, but essentially saying, "I carried a gun, so you didn't have to." Very tangible, but for him, and very emotional. Like this, I went through a lot to get where we're doing, so that you could just have the opportunity to go to college and pick your own path. But to his benefit, a lot of his influence was indirect. It was his even through all of the negative, the idea that service was so important. That these key themes, if you will, rather than what he was saying, it was more about service and pride and involvement, and that's something that I think resonated with me from an early age, teens into early 20s, which was service as a theme for me was always a big one, and while, like, I kind of previewed some of it, I have a very Forrest Gump line, irrational trend line through my professional life. Almost all of it has been connected by service, so his kind of role model role, both verbal and just his experiences and everything else, probably played a very, very big role in that as well. That, you have to find that for yourself, how you serve and how you contribute, but I think his early conversations on that were certainly very formative for me in a lot of ways.
What would you say is the most valuable lesson you've learned from a security incident or operational failure?
I probably double down on a handful of our near what I call near misses or actual misses where loss of life or, injury, trauma, all of those things. I think the biggest mind shift and the biggest change is from that kind of like all things are physical security. Now, I don't live in a cyber world. For me, physical security is the closest analog to what I deal with. You can't secure your way out of a human threat. You can't. It's part of the conversation. In other words, I tell this anecdote in front of classes all the time. If you gave me $1,000,000 and said, "Spend this on physical security," I'd spend that in a second. Yeah, we can always do better at all of these core things. I said, "But in 1 second, I can undo a great physical security program by human behavior." And not even intentionally bad human behavior, but just things like, hey, we're Midwestern, Minnesota nice, as they say, leaving doors open for people, propping doors, letting people in. That we've got multi-million-dollar access control system in a corporate entity undone in a second by somebody being polite and letting a stranger through the front door who appears to be appropriately admitted, but we don't know these things. So for me, it's that transition from everything when you're in law enforcement and military, everything is response, is infrastructure, it's tangible, new cameras, doors, armor, whatever it is, whatever your world you're playing in. And I've had to make the entire switch over to say, you know what? All that's great. And we'll talk about it. I've had security roles where I've owned all of these conversations, not just violence prevention. But 98% of violence prevention is in the human element, is in the human sphere. So we have to get better at having those conversations. So when we have tragedies and we do our research or we look at what the government research is or private sector, we realize that there's always signs of impending violence. There's always leakage, we call it. There's always other things happening in this pathway to violence that if we get good at finding these things and reporting them and analyzing them, we can really make a difference. It's not just pie in the sky. It's research backed. This stuff does work. So if I had the other thing I do in front of classes is say, is if you could give me only $1 as a budget, I'd spend it on training and awareness programs because I need to change behavior. It can't be a compliance exercise. Violence prevention isn't a 20 slide online computer-based training. That's a compliance exercise, and there's a reason we do compliance things, but that's not behavior change. So what am I doing to impact behavior? And I think if we can focus on behavioral change for the better and invest our time and energy and technology and whatever else to reinforce that, then we'll actually be in a much better place.
Absolutely. That's actually aligns very well with how I see cyber. I mean, very often the human is the challenge we have to overcome, not necessarily the technology.
Absolutely. And for me, I work with technology. I've been very, very embracing of AI and large language models and how can I leverage this from a violence prevention things. I have projects ongoing where I'm trying to leverage technology to do these things. For me, it has to be the right technology applied appropriately. So it's kind of a two-part test. Is this fixing something that is a problem for me? And is it being applied properly? Because a lot of people can spend a lot of money on technology and they're not actually fixing their problems. They're possibly creating others by having extra layers of stuff they don't need. But I'm all in on technology. If you have a problem, know the problem first and then fill that with the appropriate technology for you and your organization. So I'm a big fan. It's more of a cautious approach. Find the problem first and find the best fit to close that gap. And for me, it's closing human gaps. If we can find a way to reinforce these things to help people make better decisions, then all in. Absolutely.
Absolutely. How do you approach building trust within your team?
For me, I think, for example, when I was in a large corporate threat assessment team environment, for me, it was embracing the other or the arguments against things. So it's almost like red teaming if you're in the military context. You don't necessarily have to have an official red team process or power, but if you have people on your team that are good at identifying gaps in your logic or, hey, I'm Jameson, I'm the team leader, let's do this today or this week, or let's approach this problem this way. Having people speak up, obviously politely and respectfully, but with other ideas, even if they counter your own as a leader, if you can embrace that, you'll develop trust. And I think for me, it can be uncomfortable at times because you think you got a great decision, you've got a collective, everybody nods their head, life is great. And then there's always one person who says, "Well, hold on now. Have we thought about this?" And a lot of times you want the, "Hey, we've come to a consensus." If you can find those folks and embrace them, I think you'll have a better product in the end because they'll see things you don't. And that embraces when we talk about behavioral threat assessment and management, our best practice is multidisciplinary to put as many people around the table, the right decision makers, but have different hats, HR, security, mental health, law, all of these folks, because I don't have those perspectives. I woke up with a bias towards law enforcement, military, and corporate security. My lens is different than HR's, but I need their perspective. And this is a roundabout way to say, if you embrace those voices in the wilderness, those lone voices that might be contrary, that's a good thing. And in the long run, will actually get people more comfortable and speak up when something doesn't feel good. Or you can get in a routine and say, every case up till now has been just like this. Every threat up till now we've managed like this, and life is good, and we all ended up going home happy at the end of the day. You want the contrarian voice because that's the one that's gonna give you that piece of information that you didn't even think about before. But if you have a bad culture or bad leadership style, those folks won't speak up. They'll keep it to themselves, and that's where you're gonna miss something. And in our business, missing something means somebody gets hurt. So it kind of starts with your willingness as a leader to take some of these inconvenient feedback opportunities or inconvenient hand raisers and embrace them in a way that maybe you weren't comfortable with at the beginning.
That's a good one. And it definitely aligns with my experience in terms of getting as many different perspectives and different backgrounds. And I'm a
100%.
I'm a fan of exceedingly different backgrounds. I've had PhD biochemists working on routers, and it's like, but they bring something that other people don't have. It just makes for a great team, in my experience.
Absolutely.
So, how do you define success for your team?
Authenticity matters, and I it's probably oversaid in a lot of ways. I'll just speak for me as an individual. I think a lot of feedback that I got when I was well under in my way in this violence prevention world was people would come to me after I either do a presentation or training or even just a longer sit down conversation, and they'll say, "You really believe this stuff. I can tell you're very passionate." I think they use the word passion, and that's not patting myself on the back, but I wear it on my sleeve. Like this is when I talked about the kind of common thread line for me is this thread line of service. And now I've sort of settled into this role of violence prevention and threat assessment. If you can speak authentically to things that you're passionate about and be knowledgeable on it, but also passionate, that comes through in how you talk and engage with other people. So whether you're working in my world or a different world or in cyber, being authentic and passionate, I think changes hearts and minds. That gets the buy-in. For me, and we talked earlier, I need to have that buy-in early. I have to try and break through some inertia that exists in every organization, public or private, big, huge Fortune 5 all the way down to a small faith-based nonprofit. This is the way we've always done it. This is what's worked for us. We've never had an issue. And I have to come in and not do a job of scaring people. I have to come in and for me, I can find my greatest opportunity in letting people hear my voice and my passion and my background and talk about some of these things like these near misses, like other opportunities where gaps have happened and maybe just gotten lucky on some stuff. I think that works for a team as well. I think developing a team that really truly collecting people around you. I like collecting people who have the same passion and energy and some of those other soft skills, being able to talk about it. It's great to have passion and energy, but if you can't share that with others, if you can't be comfortable, even in a smaller group, saying, you know what, this is why I'm so passionate about this work we're doing. Let's continue on. If you can collect people around you who share some of those same, they don't, again, doesn't have to be the same perspective, but the same passions about HR, legal, IT, whatever it is. Those are the people I want on a team because they're going to be able to get the greatest buy-in from other people who are maybe already have a wall or just a bias against, bias against change. I often come in as a change influencer in a lot of ways. Like, here's some things we can do to change. But if you come in like a robot and say, you know what, the SB 553 in California says you should do X, Y, and Z, and you're not doing any of those, you're liable. That may be factually correct, but I need change. I need people to buy in and say, "Yes, let's continue to have this conversation." So, for me, it is passion and energy and finding people, like-minded people with different hats on who can talk the same way I do or not that I've got it right, but the energy and passion I think comes out. It really helps, open doors.
I imagine that's incredibly powerful. I also imagine it's difficult to go into a new group in your role and not be bringing doom and gloom and talk about it kind of in a constructive, positive way. I'm sure that's hard.
It is, and I guess, my role here, with CPPS is fun in a lot of ways and different than being, you're permanently embedded full-time employee where this is your team every single day. Every week, I have to engage with a new team or new leadership or new threat assessors who are new to the profession and get them impassioned in a way that they can see the value in their work and set them on the right path. Because I'm only then with them for a couple of days or a couple hours. How do I get them motivated to go out the rest of their year and abroad? For me, it just works. And I'm sure there's other styles and other ways of doing it. But if I can be authentically passionate about things I believe in, and it fits in the work, and all of these things are in alignment, it's amazing to see what can happen with that.
So if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, out of focus, off track, how do you get things back in line?
For me, a lot of times it's just for stepping back, and I have a hard time. I mean, I guess the reason I have a hard time articulating this is I still have a hard time with this. When setbacks, delays, unexpected challenges. I think my wife's always got a great perspective, which is, maybe you just need to stand up and go do something else for a little bit. When the weather's nice, I live in Minnesota, so I get about half a year where the weather's nice. I'm not much of a cold person, if you can't tell. We're just going for a walk or going outside. I mean, I know it's people use the term touch grass a lot now. I seem to hear that in social media everywhere. But going outside and just taking 5 or 10 minutes, grab a Diet Pepsi, go outside, take a deep breath helps. I'm not a gym rat per se, but keeping a good routine of some kind of exercise in the morning doesn't, I mean, I don't go anywhere anymore. I do everything at home or in local. Having a good healthy routine, I can tell how much it benefits because when I don't do it, that's when I can start seeing that affects my mindset. Like if I haven't been able to exercise for a couple of days or haven't been outside in a while because the weather's terrible, it impacts the mood, it impacts the work. So for me, I'm not great at it, but if I remind myself to take a pause, sometimes you just want to power through a problem. You just want to, like, I've got 100 emails. I'm supposed to write this document. I'm supposed to analyze this thing. I don't have time. And the problem is if you don't step back and even take 5 or 10 minutes, you're actually going to be much further delayed in the long run because you're just going to continue to grind. And the grind doesn't always make sense. Sometimes you just need to take a breath. I still, at 50 plus years old, I still need to figure out how to do that better and find better ways to do it. But we still learning.
I would say I think a lot of us do. I think we're in the same boat. Is there one thing that you do as a leader that you would like to see more leaders doing?
For me, I came from a world where quick and decisive decision making was always critical. That was just kind of ingrained in you. You were trained and encouraged, and life or death, whatever it was, that quick, definitive action solves problems, that prevents things from happening. And in the world we live in now, or the world that I'm working in now, that isn't the case. And not that that doesn't have a role. There's response roles and all sorts of things, security. But being able to sit back, we talked about taking breaks and being able to pause, being more deliberate in decision making, I think is critical. And when you feel like you're under the gun or your team feels like there's no time, sometimes that's true. Sometimes you're just forced to make a decision. And so I fall on a couple different credos. One, I'm always going to look for the 80% solution now. That's sort of a metaphor that I've adopted from other writers that I've really taken heart, which is I'm not going to sit here and fight for 100% solution because it's probably going to take me a long time. And quite frankly, if we're doing some of those things we talked about earlier, this multidisciplinary, multi-perspective role on what we do, we're almost never going to get 100%, nor are we going to have enough information to make decisions any better. In other words, if I'm worried about a violence issue, I have all sorts of questions I want to ask and information I want. But at the end of the day, I'm going to get like a fifth of that. And I'm just going to have to make the best decision. So what I try to do and reinforce for me when I'm working in a solo capacity or for a team when I'm working in that environment is say, make the best decision you can right now with the information you have and then evolve. So make the decision. You got 80% solution. Something didn't work. Bring the team back together tomorrow, an hour later, 5 minutes or whatever it is with the new information or the new output. And then say, you know what, that didn't work the way we wanted to, or it didn't have any impact the way we thought it would. Great. What's our next 80% decision? And so it's a series of informed snapshots in time that over time gets you trending in the right direction. I think people like me or with my background, some people can fall in the trap of trying to be overly decisive and looking for the perfect answer right now. And then you just get in this analysis paralysis people talk about. I think That's dangerous for us and what we do. There are times where decisive immediate action is absolutely valid, but it's a different world I live in now where we've got to make different types of decisions and different types of collective decision making that just doesn't allow for that. So that's my perspective on it. It's something I try to take into new teams as I train, which is, look, you're never going to understand. This is human behavior. There's no science book on making a perfect judgments on human behavior. We like to think we're good at it, but at the end of the day, we're using the best research we have, the best practices from our industry, et cetera, to make our best, most informed decision. And sometimes we're just not going to get it right. And that's okay. We're trying. And as long as we follow our process and we stay true to what we're doing and why we're doing it, that passion and stuff I talked about earlier, then you're going to make the best decisions you possibly can. And then, but be flexible enough to change directions. I think that's the other unspoken part that we forget sometimes, which is when something doesn't work or one of your decisions or paths ends up not being what you wanted or getting you a result that you were hoping to avoid, being able to take a pause and say, okay, that didn't work. Now what? Any ideas? And this is where it comes with building those teams and your red teamers, your loud voices in the wilderness. Hey, this didn't work. What are your thoughts? And being willing to hear a new direction. It takes flexibility. Folks that are inflexible or unwilling to hear contrarian information have trouble with that. And I think that can bite not only them, but the organization they represent.
Absolutely. How did that phrase go? The only time you can expect to have all the information is in the postmortem report, and that's not always going to be everything.
Yeah. I mean, and in our world, that is, it's so true. I mean, just the research on violence and the pathway to violence and what we learn about every single incident after it occurs are always very, very consistent. With people knew things, people saw things, people didn't share things. This is human behavior. Again, we're trying to make sense out of psychology and sociology and all of these ologies involved in human behavior, where in the end we have informed decisions and we just do the best we can. And sometimes you want something a little more concrete. You want more definitive answers. People want that from you, especially in crisis. And sometimes you have to caution and say, look, we're going to put in all the measures we think make sense right now with the information we have, but we're going to wait and see how it works and be able to flex. So let's be ready to do that, get this group back together and figure out what step B, C, D might be.
What's your go-to advice for new people in your field?
I think the power of the network is so important. I've solved way more problems, not because of my own knowledge or so-called expertise, but in networking with other like-minded individuals across industries. LinkedIn is a big one for me, but even more so, I mentioned the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. I have influenced in the right way more high-risk cases because of connections that I've never met personally or maybe only heard of professionally by going into the network and saying, I need somebody who's got this perspective or expertise or is in this geographic area that's part of a trusted network, and being able to leverage that, being able to say, I don't know the answer to everything. And I don't. I know what my biases, I know I have them and I have my blinders, but being able to call in a bench of people professionally that you've worked with to say, even me, when I was working threat assessment cases from a corporate perspective where I'm a full-time employee and I have all these certifications and all of this experience and background. Sometimes I'll go to my boss and say, we need to bring in a PhD level operational psychologist for this because we're getting into a realm that I don't specialize in. And I think we're going to need that perspective. Being able to ask for help, having the network, I think for me are two huge ones. Having a deep bench of people that after a while you just develop relationships across these industries and say, I'm working a case in Arizona. I don't live in Arizona. I don't work in Arizona very often. But I know if I had a problem in Arizona, I could have 3 or 4 names in a trusted network within 5 or 10 minutes and be able to at least have a plan. So very critical in what I do.
Yep, I imagine. What is your approach to mentoring the next generation?
It's kind of a combination of all the things we talked about already. Being able to talk passionately about what you believe, even if you're not somebody who overshares probably the way I do. being an eternal student, a lifelong learner, I think is the official phrase for it, but somebody who's really when you find people like that, it's kind of I'm self-selecting in a lot of ways for people I like to have around. They tend to have the same energy and passions I do, so I like to collect those people. Really fostering that. So if you're not, if you're a generalist and I need a specialist, being able to foster opportunities for learning, getting people to conferences and other events where it might not be in an area they're even working in full time, but to be able to broaden horizon, be that kind of multidisciplinary perspective on things, fostering opportunities for new members to receive training, and even more so, develop some of those networks, start developing. Those take years to develop. And where I'm at right now probably took 15 years of just incessant, never ending, uncompromising networking, even when it's not very exciting or whatever. I wish I could have cut that timeline down by 15 years and had that network a long time ago. But start developing those things. That's a gap that when I talk to folks who are in law enforcement looking to make the switch over, that's a big gap because they haven't been present on social media. They've learned to be distrustful of being public facing, especially in law enforcement. And now I'm asking them to do the exact opposite, which is get out there, connect, have conversations with people that aren't like you or don't have your background. Find a reason to reach out to this person and say, "Hey, I'm Jameson. Do you have a moment for coffee? Can we get together over Zoom nowadays?" Whatever. That's an unnatural act for a lot of us with that similar background. So, being more comfortable with that will really help in the long run for sure.
That's a tricky one, definitely. Are there any trends you're tracking developing in the space that will kind of change the way we look at and approach these problems?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a ton. Our current political and civil discourse is, to say it politely, a little coarse right now, and that really doesn't, irregardless of politics, my job is to worry about violence, and so this current climate is very concerning. The other thing is we're seeing in my realm this change, and I'd have to speculate on some of it, so maybe I'll opine a little. This idea that you can have somebody who wants to do violence on large groups of people, and you can pick your tragedy, but their driving motivation is a little bit different nowadays, and I think it's a generational thing. I think it comes from being online digital natives that grow up on devices versus the way maybe you or I did, are getting influenced in different ways now by different groups. And what we're starting to see from a threat management perspective are people that don't have a cohesive, fully understandable ideology that drives them. I came from terrorism in a lot of ways, both military and law enforcement, where motivation, ideology, and recruitment and mobilization around religion, around single issue advocacy, whatever, at least you understood it. You didn't have to agree with the ideology, but if you come from that background, you look at a situation, you go, I see what they wrote. I see what they wrote on their weapons. I see what clothing they wear. They're paying homage to all sorts of different prior shooters. So it's not necessarily about ideology anymore. It's about death. It's about mass violence in an end of itself. And that's a very different way. And so we're starting to see the terminology in the research side is called nihilistic violence, which is I just want things I feel miserable. I'm overgeneralizing by offensive amounts, but Jameson is at the end of his rope. He wants to die. He wants to do violence, and so now I'm going to go out and find motivating connections like that. Prior shooters in other countries, people with higher body counts. So it's all this dark, depressing stuff. But I'm going to go out there and seek it and use it as a motivation. Not necessarily I'm going to levitate to their ideology. I'm just levitating to the fact that they were successful in being in perpetrating mass violence. So I'm just gonna take it all source. I'm taking it from everywhere. I'm gonna embody that and use that as a motivating factor so that I'm not just talking about suicide now, I'm talking about body count and high body counts. It's a very different way to look at targeted violence, and there's a lot more research happening on that right now. So for me, that's one I'm just keeping my eye on because, again, from my background, it's harder to understand violence if we don't understand motivation, and some of that stuff is changing now, and I think it's changing because of generational, because of technology, because of social factors and other things that are harder to wrap. It's easier just to say, I worked significantly on Al-Shabaab, ISIS, like religious motivated terrorism. So you learn all about religiously motivated terrorism, and you understand these folks and how they go from being a teenager to a suicide bomber, or a teenager to a vehicle attacker, because it's understandable. And then you try to take those lessons and go into the world and prevent violence, and you realize there's all sorts of different motivating factors. And now with this new stuff coming, I call it new, I'm sure it's not, but more and more aware of a violence that has an entirely different typology in a lot of ways for us kind of end users. Like, how do I understand a person who just wants to hurt people but doesn't have any identifiable underlying motivations? It's a tough one. It's a really interesting area. I know I probably beat that one to death, but I'm fascinated by it. Part of it is because I'm not that solid in it. I need to learn more about it.
Yeah, it's simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. It seems like you've gone from a world where even if, yeah, as you said, you don't agree with the motivation, but you can understand that they have a clearly defined motivation, and you may be able to kind of intuit things about them and about their approach based on the motivation to, raw level of destruction. I can't imagine.
And it's difficult, and then you're, as a consumer of the news, which I am by default, as a consumer of news, you see the news attempting to frame this violence in a way that makes sense for their readers or viewers, and they're still looking at it from that same old perspective, which is, well, we never understood the motivation of this. And sometimes you have to say, like, when I'm interviewed on some local things that come up, sometimes we don't know their motivation because they don't have one, or they don't have one that's going to make sense. We're trying to put a box around it so we can understand it and accept it. It's part of the human condition. We're trying to help define things so that our mind can accept it and process. This nihilistic violence is something that's harder to describe. Therefore, it's harder to describe in the news. It's harder for consumers of news to understand. Sometimes these folks are in a very, very bad place, and they want to externalize that by taking lots of people with them, and there might just not be a connection between them and their targets, other than it provides a great opportunity for them, or they have knowledge about the building, or whatever it is. It's not necessarily religious or single issue terrorism or any of these other things that's driving them. It's just their psychology and their view of bringing their suffering to an end by giving other people their suffering.
I think on that note,
On the light end of things.
I think we're out of time, so we'll wrap it up. Before we go, if people want to follow along with your work, is there somewhere for them to go?
LinkedIn and X now. I'm on both. Easy to find. Jameson M. Ritter on X. You can do a search for my name. I think I'm the only Jameson Ritter on LinkedIn. I'm probably pretty easy to find there. You can follow me on the work that I do, and some of this AI work that I'm working on violence prevention can all be found there. So happy to connect and enjoy that conversation online as well.
Awesome. Jameson, thanks for the fascinating conversation.
Great. This was fun. Thanks for having me.